In the early years of World War II, the Atlantic Ocean was not a battlefield of equals. It was a hunting ground. Between 1939 and 1942, a relatively small force of German U-boats came dangerously close to strangling Allied supply lines, sinking ships faster than they could be replaced. And they didn't do it with futuristic technology or overwhelming numbers. They did it by exploiting a system that wasn't ready for them. At night, in bad weather, far from land and air cover, entire convoys vanished almost without warning. Escorts chased shadows. Sonar failed. Help was often days away. Sailors called the most dangerous stretch of ocean the Black Pit, and for a time, it truly belonged to the submarines. But if this was the peak of U-boat power, why did it collapse so suddenly? And how did the Allies dismantle an enemy that once seemed untouchable? To understand why the U-boats were so effective, it is essential to understand how they actually operated. Between 1939 and 1942, German U-boats dominated the Atlantic because naval warfare conditions overwhelmingly favored their design, tactics, and operational doctrine. Despite being called submarines, U-boats spent most patrol time on the surface, where they were faster, had greater endurance, and could visually scan the horizon for targets. Submerging was reserved mainly for daylight attacks or emergency evasion, making them closer to surface raiders than true underwater vessels. This approach maximized speed, visibility, and flexibility, while minimizing exposure to the limited and unreliable detection systems fielded by Allied escort forces during the early, uncertain years of the Atlantic campaign itself. This operational model fit perfectly with German commerce warfare strategy. On the surface, U-boats cruised at roughly 10 knots and could sprint faster when necessary. Underwater, speed and endurance were severely limited, encouraging commanders to fight primarily at night using darkness and weather instead of concealment. Night surface attacks allowed submarines to penetrate convoys, strike merchant ships, and withdraw before escorts could organize effective counterattacks repeatedly across successive evenings, with devastating cumulative effect against overstretched and inexperienced Allied defenses overall. The true power of the U-boat lay in wolf pack tactics developed under Admiral Karl Donitz. Submarines formed long patrol lines across expected convoy routes. When a convoy was sighted, the observing U-boat reported its position by radio and shadowed the target at distance. Headquarters ashore then coordinated nearby submarines, directing them to converge for a massed attack conducted primarily at night. These attacks overwhelmed escort defenses, allowed repeated strikes over several days, and maximized psychological pressure on convoy crews, while German command retained centralized control throughout engagements at sea. Allied responses initially failed to match this coordination. Escort vessels were too few, often poorly trained, and rarely operated as cohesive teams. ASDIC sonar, the primary detection tool, worked only against submerged submarines and suffered from severe technical limitations. Rough seas, ship turbulence, and temperature layers frequently distorted sonar readings, while attacking ships lost contact when passing over targets. Once a U-boat penetrated inside a convoy formation, escorts were often blind during the most dangerous moments, leaving merchant ships exposed to sudden close-range attacks from multiple directions at night simultaneously. Air power, which later proved decisive, was initially insufficient to protect convoys. Land-based aircraft lacked the range to cover the central Atlantic, creating the mid-Atlantic gap beyond aerial protection. In this vast region, convoys faced coordinated U-boat attacks with little warning, no air support, and limited defensive options. Sailors called it the Black Pit, a place where submarines operated with near impunity and where escort commanders often felt dangerously isolated from timely reinforcements, intelligence updates, and aerial intervention entirely alone. German intelligence further compounded these advantages. For long periods, German naval intelligence could read Allied convoy codes, allowing submarines to anticipate routes and position wolf packs accurately. These successes reinforced confidence during the so-called happy times, when sinkings were high and submarine losses appeared manageable. By late 1942, the Atlantic campaign had become a brutal war of attrition the Allies seemed to be losing. convoys still sailed, but losses mounted and the U-boats retained initiative across the oceanic battlefield overall. If you're finding this kind of historical breakdown useful, consider supporting the channel. Leave a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because from this point forward, the peak of U-boat success also marks the beginning of their strategic decline. The Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic was not the result of a single breakthrough, but of a strategy so complex that it redefined how naval wars could be fought. In 1943, the Allies did something unprecedented. They fused intelligence, detection technology, air power, weapons, doctrine, and industrial capacity into a single operational system. Instead of reacting to U-boat attacks, they transformed the Atlantic itself into a hostile environment where submarines were constantly exposed, hunted, and destroyed. This integration shocked the German command, which had prepared for incremental improvements, not a total systemic shift. Intelligence was the first pillar of this transformation, but it was used differently than before. The capture of the U-110 in 1941 had allowed Allied cryptanalysts to break German naval enigma codes, revealing U-boat positions and intentions. This advantage disappeared in early 1942 when the Germans added a fourth rotor to Enigma, plunging the Allies into an intelligence blackout during one of the most dangerous periods of the war. Losses soared, demonstrating how dependent earlier Allied defenses had become on decrypts alone. By spring 1943, Enigma was being read again, but Allied commanders had learned a crucial lesson. Intelligence could no longer be treated as a fragile secret used only to avoid danger. Instead, it became an offensive weapon. Even delayed or partial decrypts were now used to position escorts and aircraft aggressively, increasing the chances of contact rather than minimizing risk. Intelligence became one input among many, feeding a larger machine designed to force U-boats into combat on Allied terms. Finding the enemy no longer depended on code-breaking alone. High-frequency direction finding, known as HF/DF or HUF-DUF, exploited a fundamental weakness in U-boat operations: radio communication. Wolf pack tactics required submarines to transmit frequent reports to headquarters. HF/DF allowed Allied ships to determine the direction of those transmissions instantly, even without decoding the message. With multiple ships, bearings could be triangulated, revealing U-boat positions with deadly accuracy. HF/DF worked because the Germans underestimated it. Confident in Enigma, they transmitted prolifically, unaware that message volume itself was betraying them. Even a single bearing could be decisive. An escort sent down the bearing line could force a U-boat to dive, slowing it and preventing an attack. In effect, detection alone often neutralized submarines without a shot being fired, reshaping the tempo of convoy battles across the ocean. Radar completed the exposure of the supposedly invisible enemy. Early Allied radars, operating at 1.5-meter wavelengths, struggled to detect small submarine targets. The development of the cavity magnetron changed everything. New 10-centimeter radars could detect a U-boat's conning tower at night, in fog, or during heavy weather. Darkness, once the submarine's greatest ally, became a liability. German commanders misread this shift. They believed radar alone explained the sudden Allied success and invested in countermeasures that failed to address the real threat. U-boats carried radar warning receivers that could detect older wavelengths, but were blind to 10-centimeter systems. As a result, submarines surfaced at night believing they were unseen, only to be detected and attacked with devastating regularity. Air power ensured there was no safe space left. Very long-range B-24 Liberators finally closed the mid-Atlantic gap, the vast area where convoys had previously sailed without protection. Escort carriers extended air cover even further, maintaining near-continuous patrols over convoys. Aircraft forced U-boats to remain submerged for long periods, draining batteries and limiting speed, while attacks from the air accounted for a growing share of submarine losses. The danger followed U-boats home. Allied aircraft resumed attacks on submarines transiting the Bay of Biscay, striking them as they departed or returned to their bases. These final miles of a patrol became among the most lethal. Submarines were lost almost within sight of reinforced pens, undermining morale and shortening operational lifespans. The ocean was no longer merely contested. It was saturated with threat. Detection mattered only if it led to destruction, and here new weapons proved decisive. The Hedgehog, a forward-throwing anti-submarine weapon, allowed escorts to attack without losing sonar contact. Its efficiency was revolutionary. Roughly 1 in 5 Hedgehog attacks resulted in a kill, compared to 1 in 80 for traditional depth charges. This shifted the engagement from harassment to annihilation. Air-dropped weapons reinforced this lethality. The introduction of the Fido, or Mark 24 acoustic homing torpedo, allowed aircraft to attack submerged submarines with unprecedented effectiveness. Combined with better sonar, sonobuoys, and radar cueing, the Allies could now track, pursue, and destroy U-boats faster than ever before, collapsing the survivability curve of the submarine fleet. Industrial power amplified every success. By 1943, Allied shipyards were producing escorts, aircraft, and merchant vessels in numbers the Germans could not match. While Allied production exceeded losses, German submarine losses outpaced new construction. This imbalance became decisive in May 1943, when Admiral Karl Donitz ordered the withdrawal of most U-boats from the North Atlantic, conceding that continued operations were unsustainable. Doctrine provided the final shock. Under Admiral Max Horton, Allied forces shifted from convoy defense to aggressive hunting. Support groups were formed to pursue contacts independently, reinforcing convoys or roaming known U-boat areas. Convoys themselves became bait, drawing submarines into zones saturated with escorts and aircraft. The initiative passed permanently to the Allies. This transformation was institutionalized with the creation of the U.S. 10th Fleet. For the first time, intelligence, scientific analysis, training, and operations were integrated under a single command. The Atlantic Campaign became a model of systems warfare, where speed of adaptation mattered as much as firepower. The U-boat had not been outclassed by a weapon, but by an ecosystem designed to destroy it. May 1943 marked the decisive turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic, when Admiral Karl Donitz ordered the withdrawal of most German U-boats from the North Atlantic. It was more than a temporary pause. It was an acknowledgement that the campaign, as it had been conceived, was no longer viable. Submarines continued to operate for the rest of the war, but they never again posed an existential threat to Allied supply lines or regained strategic initiative. What defeated the U-boats was not obsolescence of the platform itself, but obsolescence of the assumptions behind it. The submarine had relied on invisibility, surprise, and freedom of maneuver across vast ocean spaces. By 1943, those conditions no longer existed. The Atlantic had become transparent, monitored, and aggressively contested. Every radio transmission risked detection. Every surfacing risked radar contact. Every attack invited swift retaliation from sea and air. The true Allied innovation was systemic. Intelligence, HF/DF, radar, air power, weapons, doctrine, and industrial production were not deployed independently, but fused into a single operational framework. This war of systems allowed the Allies to adapt faster than the Germans could respond. Improvements reinforced each other, creating a cascade effect that rapidly overwhelmed U-boat defenses and eroded their survivability. The legacy of this transformation extends far beyond 1945. Modern anti-submarine warfare is built on the same principles forged in the Atlantic: persistent surveillance, integrated command, and layered responses. The lesson was clear and enduring. Dominance at sea no longer depended on a single weapon or platform, but on the ability to connect technology, intelligence, and decision-making into one coherent whole. When that happened in 1943, the future of submarine warfare changed forever. If you want to see what truly changed the balance of the war, watch how Germany discovered the real scale of American power in the video on the screen right now.